Hi people, Moin away from back here again as always and as usual. This is going to be a quick extension on the article called Elemental Spirits, which you can find linked in the description below with this video alongside other videos embedded in it. Everything that is to be said about elemental spirits is already in that article as well, and or the embedded videos. This is, as you can tell based on the header as always and as usual, the a brief discussion regarding anti-elementals, essentially the opposites, polar opposites and or plain opposites, just plain opposites of elemental spirits. Now, long story short, common sense tells you honestly, for at least a good deal of people that are knowledgeable on elemental spirits, that if you've got elemental spirits, then you've also got spirits that are not so kind and generous, that fall under the same aforementioned classical conventional four elements: earth, air, fire, water. Now for earth, as opposed to general gnomes, the kind of gnomes that you know, GNOMES, you've got leprechauns and or dark gnomes, and their specialties in relation to them as well as the rest of the elementals is the same, and yet in a malevolent manner as opposed to a beneficial, benign manner, okay, as opposed to a virtuous manner that or virtuous properties of the default elemental spirits that they can bestow upon anyone that works with them. So if, for example, a regular gnome can help you with money and whatnot through guiding you through treasure, or simply help guide you towards investments, you name it, and dealing with nature, then you can imagine that a leprechaun or a dark gnome, as opposed to a regular gnome, will do the same, but in an inverted manner and or fashion, to the point where you will get into trouble. For example, like he'll get you money, but you'll find yourself deeper in debt than you can possibly imagine, even in your worst nightmares, okay? And as a result, things will snowball. Within that context, dark elementals are within a certain context similar to demons, honestly, in terms of the outcome of any working you undertake with them. But again, this is only at a base level, at a very generic level. Now, for next up, we've got undines. Those are water elementals. UNDIN, undines. Yeah, UNDINES. Now, at the opposite end, you have mermaids, and not obviously mermaids that are helpful towards people. Any water spirit that is benevolent, generally speaking, can be considered an undine, but doesn't have to necessarily be one. So you can imagine that dark elemental water spirits, so the opposites of undines, are just like that. They're the opposite. They're malevolent water beings or water entities that will, instead of bestow upon you the virtuous properties of water, just the opposite. And if you're thinking about examples, it stands for, instead of helping someone, actually drowning someone, instead of bringing about water into your life in a beneficial way so that you benefit from it. It's in an opposite, adjacent manner, such as excess flooding with all the negative consequences that follow, for example, that leads to destruction, and it just goes on and on and on, okay, and anything else in between. Excess flooding is an extreme example, but you know what I mean. Oh yeah, and before I continue, they don't have a name the way the default elementals do. They don't. Okay, they're just, you can call them anti this and anti that. For example, anti earth elementals, you name it. They fall under the scope of elementals, but they're simply dark elementals. So again, they're no name. They are also that. Just like I said, instead of gnome, regular gnome, you've got dark gnome. Instead of undine, you have dark undine. You name it. Still an undine, but dark in the sense that it's malevolent. Now, next up, the Sylphs, SYLPHS, which are aerial elementals. The opposites, rather than actually help people with intellectual things and whatnot, I'm not gonna say that they stupefy people, as in they make people stupid, but they or prone to, for example, causing intellectual confusion, if you will, overthinking, the negative elements of thought and of the spiritual properties of air overall. Okay, an extreme example is also, for example, causing a hurricane or a tornado, but that's an extreme example. And like I said, it's not a black and white issue, it's just a contextual example. And last but not least, salamanders. The opposites of salamanders are akin to chaotic fire beings that bring about the negative aspects of fire. I don't have to point out what the negative aspects of fire are, both spiritually as well as materially. An example is excess aggression in someone, rather than the correct amount of willpower that fire bestows upon someone, spiritually speaking, to the point where the person becomes courageous and whatnot. Okay, instead of being courageous, the person will become unnecessarily violent, aggressive and violent, and with all the negative consequences that follow. Now, before I close off this video, the last thing I was going to say is that I've already discussed that by default. For salamanders, they look like fiery men. For undines, they look like watery men. For sylphs, they almost look like angels, but they're quite transparent compared to angels. And for earth elementals, they look like just gnomes. The same way that you can literally just buy like a gnome, the same way that we know gnomes in popular culture, that's what they look like in general. Now, for the so-called antagonists of all the aforementioned, purely in a manner of speaking, of course, dark gnomes look like the gothic version or the heavy metal version of gnomes, and we already know what leprechauns look like, so that's just the way they look in pop media. That's generally speaking what they look like. For sylphs, so aerial spirits, they look identical to the original sylphs, the dark sylphs, but it is after a short while when interacting with them, like after a minute or so, they will all of a sudden have a dark aura around them or about them, and they will sport. They don't necessarily have to, but they generally speaking will sport a serpent's tail, like a very big serpent's tail, like the body of an anaconda. For undines, they look just like the regular undines, water spirits, but they have a malevolent, horrific, like horror look around them, about them. Like think of a horror mermaid, like a vampire mixed with a mermaid. That's more or less what they look like. And as for salamanders, dark salamanders look like chaotic fire golems. I mean, think of any fire golem. If you're a gamer, you might have seen in a video game. If not, then just Google fire golem or evil fire golem, and you'll see what they look like in general. They're quite chaotic in nature in terms of their appearance. Oh yeah, and one last thing, literally very last thing before I go, is that obviously these are general appearances. You have elementals as well based on location and situation in the world or conditions in the world, that they take on different appearances. Generally speaking, it is simply to adjust to their environment, and that includes human beings. But as a whole, they're obviously all the same. A simple example I can give, that's what I was thinking about just now, is that, for example, a gnome is, for example, the gnome that people have, the idea that people have of a gnome in their heads when you Google gnome, buy like a porcelain gnome or a garden gnome for your garden. These are more European in nature. That's why the gnomes are also Caucasian looking in appearance. Mind you, Caucasian looking, not actually Caucasian. They're more like white in an inanimate context, and their appearances differ depending on what part of the world they're in. For example, in Africa, a gnome might look different in the sense that a gnome will appear as a little black kid, for example, rather than as a thingy. Instead of a typical leprechaun like a dark gnome that you see in typical like the Irish leprechaun displayed in pop media, in Africa it might take on the appearance of a malevolent little boy that wreaks nothing but mischief. But across the board, just as a whole, it's all the same. That's just so that people keep that in mind, because you again don't expect, for example, to see a gnome take on such an appearance in a different part of the world. Okay, especially not within a mundane context. I mean, you know what people are like. So it's about adapting to the environment and making their appearance more comprehensively or comprehensibly convenient to the seer in
Hi,
question.
Marino.
Bye.
Can you check your phone?